Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Osama bin Murshid, the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And on behalf of my colleagues, it's my greatest pleasure to welcome you to the center and to recognize among us Her Excellency Hunaina Al-Mughairi, the ambassador of the Sultanate of Oman and chair of the Sultan Qaboos Oversight Board. Welcome. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, by the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, and by the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center. And for nearly a year now, we here at the CCAS have been consumed with the breathtaking political upheavals in the Arab world. And so this event is a much appreciated and I think a much needed reminder that we should still not lose sight of the rich cultural and musical traditions of the Arab world, and that really historically renewal in the arts has often preceded and heralded political transformation. So I'm looking forward to this panel. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Ambassador Elizabeth McCune, who's a former career U.S. Foreign Service officer and the current executive director of the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center. She will say a few words about the center.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and ahlan wa sahlan to everyone here. In addition to Ambassador Mughairi, for whom we're honored to have your presence, we also have another VIP, Dr. Janetta Cole, who is the director of the Smithsonian's Museum for African Art. And thank you for coming. I wanted to say a few words about the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center. It's named after the leader of the Sultanate of Oman, His Majesty Sultan Qaboos, who's an extremely wise and foresighted individual. One of the things that he has proposed and has promoted is culture. Culture is rich and very deep in Oman, and he believes it's one way in which we can increase understanding among our peoples. For this reason, we have the Cultural Center, which was established in 2005. We've grown from a small unit to one in which has wonderful exchange programs for studying Arabic. Inshallah, we'll have one for study at the Sultan Qaboos University. We have a VIP exchange programs. We host events like Oman, which was a dance theater production at the Kennedy Center. We have conferences Oman, just a variety of great activities, and we're growing and growing. It's a great pleasure for us to work with the center on this event, and a great pleasure that we have two wonderful distinguished guests from Oman and our SQCC research scholar, Dr. Anne Rasmussen, who's worked tirelessly. So thank you, and I hope you please enjoy everything.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me begin by introducing our moderator and then the panelists. Our moderator is Dr. D.A. Sonneborn, who is Associate Director of the Smithsonian Folkways Recordings. He's at the U.S. National Museum's nonprofit. He's also director of the U.S. National Museum's nonprofit record label and archival audio collection. In that role, he has been executive co-producer of over 200 compact disc publications and key digital initiatives, including Smithsonian Global Sound for Libraries. His research interests include community cultural representation, best ethical practices in fieldwork, music and Sufism, and intellectual property rights as they apply to intangible cultural heritage. Our panelists will be, first we have Nasser Al-Taee, who is the Director of Education and Outreach at the Royal Opera House in Muscat, Oman. Prior to this, he was an associate professor of musicology in the School of Music at the University of Tennessee. He holds a PhD in musicology from the University of California, Los Angeles. His primary research focuses on 18th and 19th century opera, including issues concerning representation, appropriation, race, and East-West relations. His book, entitled Representations of the Orient in the West, Violence and Sensuality, was published by Ashgate in 2010. Our second panelist is Majid Al Harthy, who is Assistant Professor of Music and Ethnomusicology at the College of Arts and Social Sciences in the Sultan Qaboos University in Muscat. His primary research interests include intercultural influences in Omani traditional music and primarily the African musical presence in Omani society. His other research interests include the intertwined relationship between the function of musical performance and the formation of identity, as well as the role of performance in spiritual experience of the so-called healing rituals such as dar and tambura. Professor Al Harthy is also a trained pianist in the Western classical tradition. He received his Bachelor of Arts in Music and Master of Musicology from the University of Arizona. He holds the first PhD in Ethnomusicology in Oman from Indiana University, Bloomington, with a dissertation entitled Performing History, Creating Tradition, the Making of Afro-Omani Musics in Grumten Sur Lifia. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I was able to download your thesis from, so I'm looking forward to reading it. Anne Rasmussen is Associate Professor of Music and Ethnomusicology at the College of William and Mary, where she also directs the William and Mary Middle Eastern Music Ensemble and serves as Department Chair. Professor Rasmussen also serves on the Faculty of Asian and Middle East Studies and has been Chair of the Middle East Studies Faculty and Co-Director of the Asian Studies Initiative. During the 2010-2011 year, her book, Women, the Recited Quran and Islamic Music in Indonesia, was published by the University of California Press, and another co-edited volume on music and Islam in Indonesia was published by Oxford University Press. During her sabbatical leave, Professor Rasmussen held the first research fellowship from the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center that supports her new work in Oman. And once again, I wish to thank our co-sponsors at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and the Sultan Qaboos Cultural Center for making it possible to host such an exceptional event and to host our very distinguished speakers. So please join me once again in welcoming them. Thanks.
In 2005, the Sultanate of Oman, in cooperation with the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, brought more than 100 musicians, dancers, craft people, and cooks here, representing Omani cultural traditions from desert, oasis, and sea. Well over 1 million visitors enjoyed the 2-week program of the 39th Annual Smithsonian Folklife Festival on the National Mall. Indeed, one of today's panelists, Dr. Al-Taee, was one of the presenters in that program. The festival's success was one foundation stone for His Majesty Sultan Qaboos opening the Omani Cultural Center here. In Oman, people rejoice with music and dance at births and weddings, use them sometimes for healing, and celebrate with them at Islamic festivals and in times of victory. Men's and women's dance is accompanied by musical instruments that display the cultural influences of the region. Stringed instruments, originally from Persia and India, wind instruments from Persia, drums from Africa, and even bagpipes, originally from Egypt, but more recently played by British military troops in residence in Oman, and now by the Omani military itself. All are parts of the sounds of Omani music. Without further ado, Dr. Taee.
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to share with you my research entitled Mozart in Muscat, Politics, Identity, and Assimilation. The Royal Opera House, Muscat, or Rome, was established by a royal decree from the Sultan of Oman in October of 2010. The decree also stated that the Royal Opera House shall be under the honorary patronage of His Majesty, and that the house shall enjoy juristic personality, financial and administrative independence. An avid supporter of music, His Majesty Sultan Qaboos bin Said had made several initiatives in the past supporting the arts, including the establishment of the Oman Center for Traditional Music, the Oriental Orchestra, and the Royal Oman Symphony Orchestra. As a receiving multi-purpose theater, Rome is envisioned to be the institution that will house all these musical venues under one magnificent roof. Only the third opera house to open in the Arab world, after Cairo and Damascus, the Rome will soon surpass both houses at the level of artistic productions, quality, and quantity of musical performances. Plan for the Rome triggered questions concerning the role within the conservative society of a young nation that continues to face economic and educational challenges. These questions grew louder as the Arab Spring political movement demanded change and justification for the lavish spending on the building and its productions. More importantly, the opening of the Rome raises questions regarding politics, identity, and the patronage in the country of Oman that has always managed to remain open to the West and Western traditions while preserving its own turath, or heritage. Ethnomusicologists have already noted the infiltration of Western classical music into various traditions and noted its impact in the debate between authenticity and modernity, identity, and the formation of the self. But the Rome is more than just a medium for performing Western music. Its mission is to preserve traditional values and serve a constructive role in initiating dialogue between civilizations. Thus, critics who highlight this from a mono-dimensional perspective fail to account for the importance of the arts in the overall development of a young nation. A proper venue for the arts is not only essential, but also economically and politically viable, as it will place Oman on the world map as a leader in tourism, culture, art management, and the arts in the region. We can trace the development of the Rome back to the early 1980s, when His Majesty instructed the foundation of the Oman Center for Folklore and Traditional Music in 1983. This was followed by the establishment of the Royal Oman Symphony Orchestra in 1985. Made entirely of Omani instrumentalists trained and educated in Oman and abroad by Western artists, it served as Oman ambassador, representing the country in high-profile national and international celebrations. Two other Oriental orchestras were established in the 80s, along with a Royal Jazz Band and dozen folk bands. Oman also features several radio stations that specializes in classical music, most notably 97 FM, which broadcast daily from 11 a.m. till 1 a.m., and with announcements in both Arabic and English. During my various travels throughout the Arab world and Europe, many have expressed their admiration for ROSO, the Omani Orchestra, which they were able to hear regularly on Oman satellite TV. Oman's philosophy in the arts is nourished by His Majesty's vision for the country, which demands the investment in the Omani citizen as the inspiration and energy that fuels any cultural, economic, and artistic growth. In his biography of His Majesty, Sergei Plakhinov presents a quote from His Majesty where he declares his love for Sibelius, Brahms, Bach, Elgar, Olsen, and states, "The Sultan's greatest passion is music. It is more than a hobby and almost as important to him as politics. It is a subject on which he is most knowledgeable. When asked which of the Russian composers he especially likes, he immediately answered Tchaikovsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Rachmaninoff." But His Majesty's passion for Western music is always balanced with his love for Arab and for the preservation of Omani folk music. Indeed, if there is one word that summarizes His Majesty's domestic and foreign policy for Oman, it is balance. Quote, "In Oman, we try to preserve our musical heritage. I cannot give preference to just one direction or to separate works. I like the music of Andalusia, Turkish and Iranian music, a lot of Indian and African music. I hope that all these efforts to develop music will lead to the fulfillment of my goal, to raise the cultural level of the people in general and musical education in particular." On the occasion of the opening of Rome, His Majesty issued a statement launching the Rome as part of Oman's continued effort in establishing a dialogue between civilizations. Quote, "Oman throughout its long history has played prominent roles in various cultural fields, and the time has come now to cap the rich march by means of adopting concepts of international culture and by effective contribution to its promotion. Towards this end, we have established the Royal Opera House Muscat as a center for cultural radiance for the Omani people and all humanity. We have sought to foster the constructive role of Oman in the dialogue among civilization and enriching cultural exchange and strengthening bonds of permanent friendship and cooperation. We are sure that the Royal Opera House will play a significant role in disseminating world heritage and reinforcing the principles of peace, coexistence, and understanding among all nations and people through art venues and, that express a common human cultural heritage of strong meaning and deep impact. From September 20th to December 21st of 2010, the Rome had its pre-launch season featuring 16 different concerts by myriad of performing orchestras, ensembles, and dancing troupes from Argentina to China. Dubbed Musical Echoes, the 3-month engagement sought to project various musical sounds from around the world and to test Omani audiences. The pre-launch program engagement featured European classical music, jazz, flamenco, Arab music, Argentinian tango, Russian, Chinese, and Turkish folk music. The least attended were European concerts by the Prague Chamber Orchestra and the Franz Liszt Chamber Orchestra, while the most popular were the performing arts dances featuring the China Disabled People's Performing Art Troupe and the Fire of Anatolia. This is not surprising, since Omani audience, like those in the Arab world, are more interested in concerts that include singing and dancing as an extension of their own music which centers around vocal and music performances. The last performance was Mozart's early opera, La Finta Giardiniera, by the Warsaw Chamber Orchestra. The premiere was significant as it marked the first opera performance of a full opera in the country's history, while posing questions concerning interculturalism, meaning, modernity, and the construction of the self in the small Gulf state. The Rome official season commenced on October 12, 2010, and was attended by His Majesty and hundreds of distinguished guests from around the world. The first part of the season is meant to dazzle, with 16 world-class performances, including 2 newly commissioned opera productions by Franco Zeffirelli of Puccini's Turandot and Gianni Quandera of Bizet's Carmen, concerts by Placido Domingo, Renee Fleming, Yo-Yo Ma, and the London Philharmonic Orchestra. 3 ballets, including Don Quixote by the American Ballet Theatre, Giselle by Teatro alla Scala Ballet, and Swan Lake by the Mariinsky Ballet. Jazz is represented by Wynton Marsalis and the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra, while the Universal Ballet of Korea will perform The Blindsman's Daughter. Surprisingly, Arab music is represented only by 2 performances in a one-night concert by Majd al-Rumi and Riham Abdul Hakim and the Arab Music Ensemble, paying tribute to Kulthum. Efforts to land legendary Lebanese Fairuz failed, and the program lacked any music from the Gulf and North Africa. Regardless, the Arabic program remains traditional, centering mainly on Egypt and Lebanon. This mission of the inaugural season clearly focuses on big international superstars performing works that are clearly Eurocentric in nature. The second part of the inaugural season, that will commence in January, however, promises to be more balanced in its offering, where the program director, ethnomusicologist Isam al-Mallah, is keen on distancing himself from the first half by drawing on a myriad of traditions for the programming. And we have one of the slides that showcase the diversity of the programming at the Royal Opera House. A similar recommendation by the president of the Kennedy Center, an advisor to the Rome, Michael Kaiser, outlines similar parameters. The first work performed was Puccini's Turandot, produced by Zeffirelli, who saw it as a, quote, cultural milestone of some sort, unquote. Zeffirelli favored the choice of Turandot over Verdi's La Traviata because, quote, Traviata's whirlwind romance might not have been appropriate for the first opera to play in the region, unquote. Seeing the establishment of Rome in Oman as an opportunity to amend cultural rifts between the East and the Muslim East and the West, following the aftermath of 9/11, Zeffirelli also states They have overcome their post-September 11 fear of being marginalized, and now they are opening up to Western culture. The Rome's inaugural season is being well received by journalists in Oman and worldwide. Most Omani newspapers have included special sections devoted to the Rome and its programming. For most Omani citizens, however, the Rome project remains an ambivalent endeavor. Modernization and globalization in Oman have encouraged reassessment of native identities, where the indigenous communities adopt self-protective responses to interventions from outside, fearing the introduction of outside culture at the expense of their own. In the case of the Rome, these protective measures came in the form of ambivalence towards the project and flat-out rejections of its mission. A recent survey of 120 participants showed the overwhelming opposition to Rome's 73% against versus 23% approval. Similarly, a report conducted by a regional newspaper showed that Omani musicians are divided about the project and question whether its focus on Western performances will overshadow promises by the Opera House officials to promote traditional local music. Abdurrahman Al-Dhahab, a retired folk dancer based in Beni Ali in the eastern region of Oman, said, quote, "Our own folk music and dance traditions are dying, and this expensive structure is going to promote somebody else's musical traditions. Aren't we importing rights into our front yard influence and watching our own culture going out of the window?" Unquote. Similarly, a published piece in an Omani forum on June 16, 2010 by folklorists at Sultan Qaboos University triggered a one-month-long debate over the merit of the Rome. Dr. Asiya Al-Buali was responding to, quote, "the growing negative sentiments," unquote, regarding the Opera House was met with attacks from most of the 212 participants. In the forum, most Omanis wrote about the lack of understanding of the opera, and more importantly, questioned the wisdom behind such an institution when most Omanis were concerned about jobs and improving their standards of living. While most Omanis continued to be ambivalent about the Opera House and its role in creating positions, the Opera House director, Hamid Al-Ghazali, the director of the facility, sees the Opera House as a window towards the promotion of local talent and the revival of local folk music, affirming that Rome, quote, "will serve as a pedestal to harmonize the local musical culture, and that the West never conflicting with our own rich musical traditions." Oman's notion of identity and how it relates to the world is evolving. Despite assertion of its nationality through heritage, national costume, Islamic religion, architecture, there's a strong and gradual trend towards modernization and the infrastructure of the countries as the infrastructure of the country develops. His Majesty's most recent speech confirmed the policy of modernization and balance. Quote, "As we affirm the rejection of Omani society of any claim that do not conform with our moderate and tolerant nature, we remind all concerned that enlightenment is highly important to truly understand issues and give no space for baseless speculation, as the Sultanate policy is based on achieving balance in life, cooperation, and love amongst all." Institutions like music and art can be seen here as reflections of the complexity and the layering where authenticity and hybridity collide to form what Simon Frith calls the new authenticity. Just as the character of Butterfly becomes a way of staging Japan to Western world through Shosho-san and the Japanese rituals, the Chinese Ice Queen Turandot showcases Oman interest in the Oriental tale. The selections of Rome two opening seasons, therefore, are not surprising. Puccini's Turandot and Bizet's Carmen are not arbitrary, as they seek to present Oman to the world as a modern state that is ready to compete with Western masterpieces with its own new productions of these canonic works. Turandot and Carmen in Oman delineate the adaptation of Orientalist works as a part of our history, thus complicating issues of identity and representation beyond the simplicity of binary format of resistance and complacency, us and them. I encountered something similar when an Egyptian journalist approached me following the conclusion of a paper I gave at NYU Abu Dhabi on Rimsky-Korsakov Scheherazade, when he said, "Scheherazade is not Orientalist, it's Oriental. It belongs to us." In Turkey, many have embraced the Alaturka finales of Mozart's piano sonata and the fifth violin concertos without paying attention to the bombastic, aggressive, and exaggerated dynamics aimed at ridiculing the Turkish themes. As a novel organization, the Rome represents a new aesthetics from the global imagination, an emerging way of capturing the present historical moment and the total reconfiguration of space and cultural identity that characterizes societies around the globe. The opening of Rome is an historic moment for the arts in the region and comes as the culmination of the sustainable cultural development witnessed by Oman for the past 41 years. Many in Oman realizes that this ambitious organization could not have been achieved without the strong support, passion, and patronage of His Majesty, and that the Rome reflects Oman's foreign policy and openness to the world, commitments to the global outreach and dialogue between civilizations through the arts. For the past 41 years, His Majesty the Sultan of Oman has actively participated in the creation of viable cultural, artistic, and musical institutions that through the formation of music or organizations, orchestras, band, archives, research centers around the world, and now the Rome ultimately functioning as a powerful arbiter of music and culture. As a true patron of the arts, His Majesty's balanced, open vision and interest in self-knowledge is forging Oman to assert its unique place in history, place it once occupied through science, navigation, sailing, trade, and exchange of culture in East Africa and the Far East. While Mozart La Finta Giardiniera made history as the first opera to be mounted in Muscat during its pre-launch season, it is difficult to say where the Royal Opera House Muscat will be in the next 10, 20, or 50 years due to the rapidly changing political, artistic, and economic factors. Regardless, and ethnomusicologically speaking, the Rome will soon broaden the scope of research into variously interlinked fundamental issues such as culture, space, identity, and meaning, appropriation, assimilations, and social politics, thus reaffirming Oman's commitment to the idea of dialogue and cultural exchange between civilizations with harmony, beauty, and benevolence. Thank you. We have images of the Royal Opera House that we will show at the end.
In the interest of time, we're going to have discussion following the presentation. So on with the show, Dr. Al Harthy.
Thank you very much. African Identities, Afro-Omani Musics, and the Official Constructions of a Musical Past. Acknowledging the African presence in the musics of Oman has been a touchy subject since the documentation and propagation of the country's traditional musics began in the 1980s, just a decade after the accession of the founder of the modern nation, His Majesty Sultan Qaboos bin Said. Based on my field research in the port town of Sur, which is historically significant both for transoceanic seafaring and trade, and more specifically for its connection to the east coast of Africa, this paper explores the subject of the African diaspora in the Omani town of Sur. Its main objective is to centralize Africa as a concept, in contrast to assuming that Africa is a mere reference. At the heart of this concept of Africa is the issue of identity, as it is articulated in such expressive modes and settings as interview and musical performance. This phenomenon corresponds to William Du Bois' concept of double consciousness in his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk, in which he describes this concept as the feeling of, quote, two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, end quote. Rhetorically, Suri musicians not only adopt, they also emphasize their national Omani identity, while expressing their African identity as of the other. Musically, however, their approach to their performance, including the use of Kiswahili text, the predominance of body movement in the so-called funun taqlidiyya or traditional musics, and the multi-layered musical textures and rhythms produced by a variety of instruments brought to Oman from Africa, culturally reveals, I argue, the musician's African identity as a self. The seemingly binary self-identities articulated by Suri musicians through two differing modes of expression, rhetoric and performance, illustrate not only the complexity in the nature of the concept of Africa in Oman, but also highlights what Gilroy has termed the epistemological predicament facing the researcher, which in Oman often leads to a simplistic treatment of the African presence in the music of this nation. On the one hand, during face-to-face interviews, no consultant of mine identified himself or herself as being of African descent. On the other hand, Africa is an essential part of the lives and identities of many in Sur. And it is through African musical genres that we must seek and see the African identity. Take, for example, my interview with two great individuals from Sur. One was a musician who had traveled to the east coast of Africa many times, and the other, educated and well-respected, took the role as moderator. This is what happened. Before this meeting, I indicated to my moderator that my intentions were to understand the relationship between the people of Sur and Africa in my journey to the study of their musics. So on the day of our meeting, my moderator initiated the conversation by addressing the musician as follows, quote, "Before we start, Majid wants to know the relationship between you guys and Africa. How did you acquire your African language? How did your arts, funun, come from there? How did you learn them there? And how did you acquire them? Did you find these arts already here in Sur? Or did your families bring them?" End quote. The first point I noticed in this interview is that the moderator began his rhetoric by asking about the relationship. But immediately after that, he followed up with specific inquiries related to the more general question in a step that I thought constrained my consultant's answers. What is clear here is that the question of identity as related to Africa was not part of the specifics. The specific points the moderator added to the more general question function as cues that indicated to the musician the limits his answers were expected to respect. The musician's response was this, quote, "More than 40 years after we left Kuwait, I have not practiced Kiswahili. In that previous era, our ancestors were traveling before we did, and they left the arts to our grandparents, to our fathers, and to us. We would go to Basra, Iraq, to carry dates and take it to India, Sawahil or East Africa, Aden, to every port. When we reach our destinations, we would throw the anchor and the Omani flag would be raised. We went to Zanzibar, Dar es Salaam, Mombasa, even Mozambique we reached." End quote. In this particular interview, we must not underestimate the possibility that the interviewee assumes what Richard Bauman has termed responsibility, quote, "for a display of communicative competence" to his interviewer. Viewed as such, an interview in this context becomes a performance of national identity in what Bauman terms competence, and defines it as, quote, "the knowledge and ability to speak in socially appropriate ways," end quote, is translated in the display of nationalism, or to put it more specifically, Omanism. Bauman emphasizes the performer's role in how communication is achieved, quote, "above and beyond the additional multiple functions the communicative act may serve," end quote. Applying this approach the Omani case of interviews may at first suggest that the message in these interviews is the only part that constitute responsibility. But every time nationalism was on display, the interviewee or the performer delivered it with authority and affirmation, manifesting in an assertive tone and hand gestures that pointed to the ground as if to say, here and now, I am Omani. In addition, a formal interview differs from that of a casual encounter, for it activates a mode of performance of today's identity versus yesterday's. And the formal interview uses equipment such as recording machines, cameras, which may be seen as equipment of evidence collection to pressure the performer to deliver his nationalism through his knowledge and acknowledgement of today's era to be evaluated by the interviewer. A performance that automatically renders, quote, a past as a foreign country, heard in such expression in Sur as في هذاك الزمان الأولي, or in that first period, or هناك, there, both expressions referring to Africa. Furthermore, to think about and speak of the African identity in Oman should not inevitably suggest the diasporic term was Swahili. In my time in Sur, I wondered how a Swahili person was defined. The answer to this question is simultaneously fascinating and ironic. Many individuals I met in Sur mentioned a specific example of a Swahili family in the community. Sometimes they identified this family as simply Ifriqi or African. To quote one of my consultants, quote, there were people from Africa who came to Sur looking for a living, and they lived here, women and men, and lived in Suri homes. They did not speak the Arabic Omani language. Here in Sur, they spoke Kiswahili until their death. They came from there, Africa. They came from there, Africa, as youth and grew up here in Sur as and they got married, had children, and their children spoke Arabic Omani. But they, the parents, did not know Arabic at all. Their tongue was too heavy to speak Arabic, end quote. The question here is not, quote, how long does it take to become indigenous, in Clifford's words? Because clearly this family spent a considerable amount of time, one may say more time in Sur than they had in Africa, and their bodies were buried in that town, Sur. So the matter here is directly connected to what Gilroy calls, quote, conspicuous lack of rootedness in the indigenous cultures. Evidently, according to the Suri perspective, a Swahili person is one who could not master the Omani Arabic language, not just one who spoke Swahili fluently. So the question is this: where and when is the African identity expressed? And more important is, how do we assess and analyze the context of this identity? It is within the province of enactment, the doing, so to speak, or the showing, that we must seek and explore the African identity. I argue that the showing within the performance sphere is not only an expression of identity, but also a cultural feature indicative of a deeper conceptual approach to revealing that identity. And what makes the space of performance an extension of the interview is that the showing here not only refers to the dynamic relationship among participants in the micro space of the art of cueing within the specific performance, which indeed is central to the process of music making within the Suri society. The showing also refers to the macro space that exists between distinct arenas of performance and non-performance. To put it in another way, the cues given within the rhetorical world of performance in Sur manifest themselves in the world of performance. What could be interpreted as the lack of articulation of an African cultural or social identity within a specific space and mode, an interview that is in fact a clue as to where the lack is compensated in the performance space with all its components. In the 1980s, national music scholarship developed in Oman for the first time. Within, I argue, an agenda to promote national integration and unity through the establishment of an inclusive cultural policy in connection with the musical cultures of the nation. Accordingly, I interpret the efforts of the Omani leadership in this field as a determination to bring harmony and tranquility to a turbulent cultural setting. In this endeavor, I contend that Sultan Qaboos bin Said, whose wishes initiated the idea of this music scholarship, attempted through music to bridge beyond oppositions, contradictions, and conflicts without negating cultural heterogeneity. As a result of this national music scholarship, or as a result, this national music scholarship was directly responsible for what I see as the most important accomplishment, both socioculturally and politically: the recognition of the three categories of Omani traditional musics: Afro-Omani song and dance, indigenous song and dance, and Asia-Omani song and dance. The official category, Afro-Omani song and dance, coined in 1985 by the Oman Center for Traditional Music, includes such African-derived musics as Mdema, Shobani, Zar, Mikwara, Tambora, all of which are still performed in Seoul, and you've seen some of the pictures here. Examining the surface structures of such various components of performance as the African drums, Kiswahili language, and the multifaceted rhythms, for example, no doubt reveal African retention and aesthetics. But the question that presents itself here is this: are these aesthetics, which certainly are indicative of an African retention, enough to declare an African identity? The answer is more complex than just a resounding yes or no. Here we should not seek to position certain specific musical performances and aesthetics, quote, as being expressive of the absolute essence of the group that produced them, to use Gilroy's words. Even though when discussing African music, we must recognize that academically we are examining music as potential evidence for the conception of Africa. One of the most important theoretical frameworks of my analysis explores the African conceptual approaches to music making in Seoul. Nketia, discussing the investigative and research methodology of the studies of the musics of African American people and its relationship with that of Africa, maintained in 1973 that, quote, African music is drawn upon for accounting for the peculiar features of Afro-American music, features singled out because they do not conform to Euro-American practice, end quote. A decade or so later, Ollie Wilson made a similar argument that the relationship between Africa and African-American music, quote, has never been adequately examined. The reason, he contends, is that the investigations of this relationship, quote, tend to make comparisons on the basis of the presence or absence of specific musical characteristics, end quote. Though he assumes the importance of these characteristics, which he terms the foreground aspects of musical performance, Wilson points out that these are only part of the story. To understand the full nature of this relationship, he underscores the necessity to investigate the deeper forces of music making, which he labels the guiding background factors on which the foreground features depend. Therefore, we must examine certain culturally specific aspects of Afro-Omani music making, such as the fundamental association and inseparability of body movement and other aspects of music, the intimate position and treatment of percussive instruments, particularly drums, the intimate relationship between the drum and its owner, and the function of Kiswahili language. We must examine these from a conceptual level and not just from an aesthetic point of view. As an investigator or observer, the transition from my ordinary world to that of musical event or experience justifies my belief that an Omani Suri performer makes a similar leap or transition when he or she makes music. This transition may further be understood through the concept of inner time or inner life in phenomenology. Understood in this context, inner time is related to various such concepts as tarab, nashwa, sultana, nash'a, na'ish, which depict the emotion of the individual during the experience of a musical performance in the Arab world, or to the getting to the next level in jazz performance. Historicizing this concept, I suggest, provides the key to understand how performers make the leap from Omani to African. As Michael Oakeshott contends, a fixed, quote, a fixed and finished past A past divorced from and uninfluenced by present is a past divorced from evidence, for evidence is always present, and is consequently nothing and unknowable. If the historical past be knowable, it must belong to the present world of experience. If it be unknowable, history is worse than futile. It's impossible, end quote. The immediate experience of a musical event represented in the outer time, what we see here, is only a manifestation of the now, of the inner life or time. It is the performing of the tradition of Mdema, Shobani, Zar, Tambura, and others. This present is constructed upon the past history, quote, which we no longer immediately live, but nonetheless is included in present experience through the performance of acts of recollection. Therefore, the Afro-Omani traditional musics in Sur, which provide the space where the African identity is at display, are in this paper interpreted as being consciously created from and based upon the past memory and recollection, both of which constitute retention. This is the result of the unbroken stream of historical experiences, and it manifests in outer time so as to be communicated. Historicizing this concept of inner time and recontextualizing it in the macro context, I again emphasize, makes it possible to conclude that what we see and hear in Sur's music, or what I call the creation of tradition, is only the surface of which a people's performed history is the deep structure. Therefore, phenomenology, as Michael Jackson maintains, quote, is less concerned with establishing what actually happened in the past than in exploring the past as a mode of present experience. Musically speaking, as Alan Merriam asserts, quote, in song, the individual or group can apparently express deep-seated feelings, not verbalized in other contexts, end quote. For Suri musicians, function that a musical performance's context provide is found in the deep structures, which I suggest is evident in the decision to give but one example, to sing and use Kiswahili in many of the dances. This use of Kiswahili is not, I emphasize, a natural consequence, accidental that is, of Omani contact with the east coast of Africa. Instead, memory and recollection of text have a specific function of keeping the concept and history of Africa, and the African identity for that matter, in the lives of many through the performance of Africa's language, Kiswahili. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sponsoring this panel. We're on our way to the Society for Ethnomusicology conference in Philadelphia. And I have to recognize a few people in addition to Zaina Saikali, my longtime friend here, who I said, hey, these colleagues of mine are coming all the way from Oman. How about if we do this in Washington? Ambassador Elizabeth McCune has been so supportive during this whole year. As last year I was nominated the research fellow for the Sultan Qaboos University, and we were sort of both finding our way, weren't we, Elizabeth, trying to figure out what it is that I should actually do. And Ambassador Mourairi, it's wonderful to see you. We have a long relationship with the ambassador at the College of William and Mary, which culminated 2 weeks ago in the signing ceremony for our own Sultan Qaboos professorship at the College of William and Mary, something that is really quite extraordinary. And so we joined Georgetown University as the third institution in the United States to be host to a professorship bestowed upon us from the Sultanate of Oman. I'm going to try to be a little bit brief here. Let me just move to a little bit later in my presentation here. Okay. This paper describes about 4 months of ethnographic research in 2010 and 11 among cultural activists and reformers who are using music as a generative force toward the development of collective identities in a geopolitical space. The astonishingly robust culture of musical patronage is entirely due to the initiatives of its supreme leader, Sultan Qaboos bin Said. And I would list all of the many initiatives, but Dr. Al-Taee has already done that for me. So I'll move right along, discussing first the cultural capital of Western European art music. Omani ethnomusicologist Majid Al Harthy calls music an ordering device for His Majesty Sultan Qaboos bin Said and the Nahda, or Renaissance, that began officially with the Sultan's declaration when he took power from his father in 1970. The initiatives by Sultan Qaboos to import the cultural capital of Western European art music alongside the Turco-Arab music of the Eastern Mediterranean region resonate with similar projects of Europeanization or Westernization as a prerequisite to modernization. For example, the project of musical Westernization 100 years earlier by the ruler of modern Turkey, Kemal Mustafa Ataturk. As Aracci writes in a new collection on the work of Italian composer and musician Giuseppe Donizetti Pasha, who was charged with bringing Italian music to the sultans of the Ottoman Empire, quote, "The Turkish court in the 19th century imported the music of Europe as a way of trying to catch up with the rapidly advancing West, where developments in science and technology had brought a new world order." Kemal Ataturk's own words from a speech he made in 1934 confirm the use of music as a civilizing agent for his new post-Muslim nation. Quote, "The speed with which a nation can transform itself is related to how well it can adapt to new styles in music." That Oman chooses to build a performing arts center rather than towering skyscrapers or a reproduction of the Louvre, projects in the oil-rich Arabian Gulf that have gained global notoriety, is significant in this nation, where the historically conservative Ibadi sect of Islam finds its roots, and where, in contrast to the overland Silk Road of the Eastern Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, or Persianate Central Asia, no traditionally urban or courtly traditions were ever developed. A symbol of class and distinction, to reference Pierre Bourdieu, the Royal Oman Opera House faces huge challenges in this young nation, where up until now, no public music institution, where there has been, up until now, no public institution outside of the events that are staged by the state. And I wanted to just mention that in the the orchestras, the Firqat al-Sultaniya, the Arabic Orchestra, and the Rosso, although they're celebrated in the press, they were off limits to me when I was there, even rehearsals. However, through the Jama'iyat Hawat al-Oud, which is a public institution, I was able to meet many of the musicians in those ensembles who invited me to their home for more informal music making. I'd like to continue on to national festivals. It is fair to say that no musician or cultural organization is immune from the project of national development. In fact, music and the other performing arts are some of the most effective and pliable agents of nationalizing agendas. The arts have been embraced and developed all over the world and used as tools for nation building and diplomacy. And there's a very rich literature in ethnomusicology on case studies from all over the world, including the United States. Based on my view of the intersection of music and nationalism, I identify three defining characteristics, while conceding that there may be many others. First, the music must be authentic, a term that connotes time and place that are unique to the nation. Second, it must project to others the aspirations and literacies of a modern nation, and particularly its leaders. Third, it should be both reflexive and generative of citizenship. It should be an honest mirror of who the people are, all of them, and what they do. National music should cultivate a sense of peoplehood. Excellently placed. On the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the Sultanate, I had the privilege of attending 4 events, 3 in the capital city of Muscat and another in the famous coastal city of Sur in the Sharqiya region. These kinds of festivals involve thousands of participants who prepare for more than a year and rehearse for months, potentially generating enormous seasonal work for a nation's cultural choreographers. As I listened to this music, I wondered, who are these musicians? Who's writing? Who is arranging? Who is playing? Who is recording? And where? I discovered that while the poetry and percussion come from the Sultanate, most of the other components of these grandiose pre-recorded soundtracks were outsourced. The music, like the majority of popular and commercial music one hears on the radio and on television, was recorded in the studios of Cairo and Dubai. When I pressed further, I was told that many of the musicians heard the people actually playing the violin, the qanun, the oud, and the nai, and Arabic percussion were cultural refugees from Iraq. A chance meeting with Hassan Hamid in the Arab music cauldron of Dearborn, Michigan, conflated with numerous conversations and connections facilitated by Fatih Mohsen and Salim Makrashi in Oman, led me to this studio scene in Dubai, where I met the Iraqi musicians who live in Dubai and interpret and perform the national music of Oman. Omani national music is thus facilitated by Arab regional interculturalism and media flows that depend significantly on practitioners from the Arab world. Studies of emergent mass media point to the multiplication of diverse roles for various parties on the line of musical production, something that will surely transpire when the country's publicized goals of Omanization are applied to the arts industries. Until such practices develop, however, non-Omani nationals will continue to benefit, as do and will artists invited to perform at the Opera House, from the extraordinary musical patronage of the Sultanate. Now on to folklore and the traditional arts of Oman. It is at national festivals where one can see real Omani musical heritage presented by and for Omanis. Yet, as we shall see from the following three settings, the hand of development is never far from the site of authenticity. Why create heritage? One arts strategist, who I interviewed at the Abu Dhabi Association for Cultural Heritage, ADASH, proposed that most traditional arts, crafts, music, and lifeways were curated in the UAE and exhibited primarily for the tourism industry. The celebration of forts and falconry, this specialist described, bordered on auto-Orientalism. In the Emirate of Sharjah, a senior researcher for folk arts and the development of culture and information, also a cultural refugee from Iraq, in charge of musical productions for the Sharjah Heritage Days, described to me the challenge he faces every year of ferreting out the same aging performers of traditional arts from an ever-dwindling pool of practitioners. The situation in Oman, the Ruh al-Khalij, the soul of the Gulf, is quite different. In comparison to its wealthy neighbors in the GCC, Oman has the highest concentration of native nationals in the country. About 2/3 of the population are Omani, compared to estimates of only 10 to 18% in the Emirates, for example. At the month-long Muscat Festival in February 2010, competition was the driving force behind the presentation of the arts in the Heritage Village, or Kuryat Itorath, a reconstructed Omani village specially built on the site of Korum National Park. 23 wilayat, or regions, participated, each for just one day over the month. Participants from each wilaya were chosen and organized by the local chapter of the Omani Women's Association, and each province was judged on a template of 12 criteria that ranged from the degree of authenticity to the involvement of women and children, the presentation of local industries, and so forth. The month-long festival culminated in a ceremony where first, second, third, and fourth place winners were announced, and regions were bestowed with cash prizes and prestige. For the researcher, the experience offered little opportunity for more than a passing exchange with participants who were only at the festival for one evening. Rather, these participatory traditions were presented for the live production of the program Asala, the title Asala meaning authenticity, that broadcast from the Heritage Village each evening. One of the two MCs for the program, Ibtihal al-Balushi, described the village as their studio as she perfected her costume of the day, her clothing and makeup that reflected the distinctive traditions of that particular region. She and her partner, along with producer Qais Ba Omar, simultaneously choreographed and filmed performances by the roving troops and exhibits of arts and craftspeople, weavers, cooks, children playing games, and so forth. Because of the tight time frame of the live broadcast, everything that the wilaya planned had to transpire within about an hour and a half. When the cameras were turned off, the performances ended. The producers of Asala, along with the judges who ranked the performances, all agreed that the primary impetus for presenting heritage in this setting was to educate the children of Oman. The point of the Heritage Village was to teach history. And I have a fantastic clip here, but I'm going to skip it. The sweet spot for this, I can play it later on, right? Or should I play it? Play it, okay. I know, they're really, it's really, so what you see here is basically they say 1, 2, 3, go, and all the performers perform at the same time. There are about 7 cameras, 14 microphones set up, and Qais Omar in his van chooses the shots. Cut to camera 3. Okay, camera 5, get ready. 3, 2, 1, camera 5, you're on. And then an MC will move to the cooking ladies and ask the cooking ladies, so what is this traditional music that you're making? And then you see in the background people are seated in stadium seating, and then there are people like me walking around with cameras around their necks. So it was a little baffling, actually, to me to try to figure out exactly what was going on until I realized that the importance of producing this television show every evening. And part of my confusion stemmed from the fact that I was never at home to watch, I was never in my hotel room to watch the show because I was always at the festival. All right, you get the idea. The sweet spot for this researcher, that's me, awaited me at the Salalah Tourism Festival, or the Mahrajan al-Kharif, a month-long event held in Salalah, the capital city of Dhofar province in the south of Oman, next to the neighboring country of Yemen, about 1,200 kilometers from Muscat. Planting myself at the Heritage House stage, Beit Torathi, every evening, I could watch performances unfold again and again, and the same people were on hand to answer my incessant questions. Each of the local bands, or firak, performed 8 times during the month of July, and I was thus able to witness the performance of various groups on several occasions, and to meet many of the musicians time and time again, who played in many of the bands, particularly the keyboard players, and backup singers. The audience, who also became used to my presence and my liminal position, returned every evening. Unlike in Muscat, this crowd made requests, sang lyrics, and contributed tashkiya, or the gestures and vocalizations of encouragement that suggest that in this context, reception is a site for the creation and definition of musical meanings. And I have a clip of a typical performance here. How am I doing? Okay, I'm going to go for it, just so you can get a sense. So I was usually sitting, the men's side is on this side, the women's side is on that side, but they sort of allowed me to just hang out with the recording engineer in the sound booth. So I was usually able to talk to all of the band leaders and ask, what is the genre, what's the title of this song, can you give me the lyrics? Here you see the men's side. And quite an exciting, this 4 hours of this, maybe 5 or 6 different bands were presented every evening. The local bands specialize in a number of Afro-Omani genres, including bara, mizmar, rabuba, and sharh. Their performances always involve dance, and the groups always include women. Writing on the bands from his hometown, I should actually go back to this. Writing on the bands from his hometown, Musallam Kathiri, now director of the Oman Center for Traditional Music, states, the affairs of these firak relating to the making, owning, or playing of these musical instruments are run by the Negroes, who carry out all the tasks performed to the accompaniment of percussion instruments. You would never find a single drum in Zofar owned or played by a person outside of these social groups. As performers identified the genres of music I needed to know, it became clear that these were musics that originated among peoples of African descent. Their presentation as national musics of Oman originated not with the codification by folklorists from the Ministry of Information, but rather with the Queen Mother herself, who encouraged the presentation of Afro-Omani arts in her court in Salalah well before the founding of the modern nation. As public celebrations, the Afro-Omani musics that I came to love in Salalah, along with Fan-e-Bahar, Afro-Omani music genres associated with seafaring, have been a part of the fabric of the Omani public sphere since Africans were brought to the region as slaves. Their participatory performances, framed as presentations, is a phenomenon that predates the musical project of nationalism. This unframed performance by the people and for the people transpired in the historic town of Mirbat for their open day, or Yom al-Maftuh. This setting exemplified all of the aspects of participatory performance as described by Tom Torino, where both simultaneous and sequential participation create egalitarian and participatory playing fields. A few conflicting visions belie the natural presentation of Afro-Omani music as a national discourse. And I'm almost done. For example, the groups from Dhofar who performed Afro-Omani genres, Bara'a, Mizmar, Rububa, performed for an audience of insiders, but most of the tourists were from the north of Oman and from the Gulf, and their music is Ayala, Razha, Razfa, so there were definitely some competing discourses, and you could see this when people came up to try to dance and so on and so forth. The manager of the Beit Torah stage deftly negotiated between these two audiences as he tried to enforce what Torino terms issues of responsibility and constraint between the bands and their audiences. Another productive tension articulated to me by the band leaders was that the festival organizers were all outsiders to the traditions they programmed. The musicians felt managed and manipulated in ways that were insensitive to the hierarchies of excellence that they themselves perceived. Finally, and in conclusion, the musicians I came to know boasted that their drumming traditions and their instrumental traditions were the richest in Oman, and indeed in all of the Gulf and perhaps all of the Arab world. Their assertions reflect more than chauvinistic bravado. Conservative Ibadi Muslims, prevalent among the tribes of Oman for centuries, historically disapproved of musical activities among their own communities, but tolerated it among other servant communities, the overwhelming majority of whom were from East Africa. It is fair to say that the music of the tribal elite, the non-servant class, has been bereft of instrumental traditions and even drumming, again something reserved for a servant class. Historically, the music of Oman's tribal elite focused on responsorial song, with the majority of more complex singing, drumming, and now musical ensembles developing among Afro-Omani populations. It is not surprising that the two regions that were consistently identified to me as rich in music, the eastern Sharqiya region and the southern region of Dhofar, which borders Yemen, have the majority of the Afro-Omani musical traditions. Afro-Omani musicians are both benefactors and victims of the process that Robin Moore has termed nationalizing blackness, as their musics are appropriated and framed as Omani performances without completely acknowledging their origins or the musical and ritual specialists who perpetuate these traditions. As the young nation continues to refine and articulate aspects of its collective identity through music, my sense is that Afro-Omani musics will be ever more present in the musical mix. While the winds of the Arab Spring waft ever so gently through this peaceful nation of respect and tolerance, the music of people originally, generations ago from Africa, could offer powerful symbols of independent and diverse voices, both for the people who perform them and for their fellow Omanis. Nationalizing blackness, to borrow again from Moore, will not only be an exercise in the appropriation of the minority for the majority, but also a part of a process in which young Omanis search for exciting and distinctive voices in the diversification of national identities. Thank you.
We've had three very different perspectives. From an outsider just now, who's come in for the first time, made some observations. We have an inside-outer, I would call him, who spent a good deal of his formative years in Africa. And we have an insider, all trained as ethnomusicologists. So I think there's a great opportunity also to address perhaps the elephant in the room, which is indeed the Arab Spring just mentioned, and what's going on in the Near East today. So, address your question, stand up, say who you are if you don't mind.
I'm just putting up Nasser's pictures here.
I may be the only person besides the ambassador who actually was at the opening of the Opera House in Oman in October. And I just have to say what a special event it was, what an extraordinarily beautiful, beautiful opera house. I'm an opera lover, and I go everywhere to see opera. And this was one of the most beautiful opera houses I've ever seen. I've been to La Scala and London and everything. But what it did, it combined the traditions of the beauty and art of that part of the world, particularly of Oman, with this type of sort of, I can't explain it exactly. It was a perfectly beautiful opera house with perfect acoustics and beautiful in every sense, but very of the place. This is what was so beautiful about it. And the visual arts were also very much heralded there, because even if you don't like music, and if you don't want to go to an opera or to a concert, you could go there just to see the beauty of it. And I want to say how privileged I was, I felt, to have been a guest there.
Thank you for your comment. I'm sure we all wish we were there.
Let's look at these here. I'm just going to slide. As you continue to moderate, Atej, I'm just going to go through these pictures.
Other comments, questions? Yes, ma'am. You are?
I'm Cynthia Schneider. I teach diplomacy and culture here. I'm so sorry I missed the beginning of your presentation, so forgive me if I'm asking a question that you answered. But I'm curious about the audiences audiences for different kinds of music. Who's going to go to the opera house? And I'm sure there's a goal to make it accessible to a wide range of people. And how are you going to do that? We certainly, we have kind of succeeded that in this country by having our movie, showing operas in the movie theater so people can go, but certainly the actual opera house is a very minuscule sliver of the population who can go. And you, Professor Al Harthy, showed that one slide of the wall with Tupac on it. And I'm familiar with the popularity of hip-hop in Oman and hip-hop dancing in particular. And obviously that's very appealing to the youth. Is there any fusion between these two audiences? Is there going to be a place in the opera house for those kinds of youthful music experiences? And how do these two meet?
Dr. Al-Taee, would you be so kind before you begin to answer is put on this microphone, if you don't have one on?
I don't know if it's...
Thank you.
Okay, I think the audience building is a challenge to any opera house throughout the world. I mean, even here in the West and in the U.S. Our job and task right now in the education is to try to open up the house to the youth and children, families, through matinee performances and open house events, and actually by going into the schools and trying to introduce our young population to the myriads of traditions in Oman. So we've had a great variety. The location of the opera house is right at the center of the most vibrant place in the capital. It's a place where there are lots of restaurants, hotels, shops, the beach. So it is strategically located so that it draws as many people from a myriad of traditions and backgrounds. We've had many Western audiences because of their interests and their familiarity with some of these. But we've had also good groups of Omanis and of Asian population. We hope that in the future that the attractions and the programming would be diverse so that it attracts and reflects the diversity of the society. So it's up to these programmings, and because of this there are tickets that range from, let's say, $25 to $150, and through that range, it can. The strategy is to appeal to as many diverse groups and backgrounds as possible.
Sure. Tupac Shakur and Bow Wow. I have other photographs. Most of the graffiti in Seoul was about either African American singers or artists, or those who were in rap music. Eminem is one of the white ones. But during my time there, I would go with my friend Khamis who is a truck driver, and we had a house speaker between us, and he would play Tupac Shakur or Bob Marley. So they are really admired in Sur, and so you see those graffitis. I don't know if they will ever be able to perform in the opera house, and this is what some of the.
They play them in dance? Is that what's going on in hip-hop dancing?
Yeah, but they don't perform publicly, Tupac. They don't. They listen to music. If you go to their homes, they can dance, but they don't perform publicly Tupac Shakur songs, and they have their own musics. And although you see the graffitis and all of that, so I don't know. Maybe Nasser. I don't know if traditional music will have. If traditional music will have a place in the opera house, I think it will be very so staged. And they don't do. All these pictures, none of them were staged. And my students, who some of them come from Sur, they ask me where the place will be. They are in the music department, and of course, everybody wants to be in the opera house.
Nasser, when do you think? What year do you think you'll see hip-hop, Omani hip-hop in the Royal Opera House?
Not sure I can tell you that. But I think it's okay to have different mediums and different places of performance for various traditions. You can't also ask one organization to just host everything. But there are venues for various traditions, and there are venues for local and international genres as well. So.
Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Shivers. Good afternoon. My name is Nicole Shivers. I'm from the National Museum of African Art. And I have a question maybe to Majid. What role, if any, do you see Afro-Omani music playing in the cultural development of Oman?
The question is, what role do you see the Afro-Omani music playing in the culture of Oman going forward?
Well, when we talk about the role, we have to speak about the official role or what we see there. And what we see, I always argue that in Sur, the African presence is stronger than any other presence, even the Arabic one, whatever that Arabic means. And so the most prominent musics in Sur are Dema, Shobani. These are African genres. They are not influenced. They are like music that came from Africa as a whole. Of course, they changed. There is an influence and so forth. So if you go to a place like Sur, you will not see Razha very much, the Bedouin. Razha is actually dying away, but these other genres are very, very strong. They are everywhere. Every occasion you will find Dema, you will find Zar performances. So many of these. And the recognition of these has not been what it should be, really. Because if we read the scholarship that took place in 1980s by the Oman Center for Traditional Music, we can find that they talk about these musics, but as aesthetics. And as I said, people don't tell you we are African or Omanis of African descent. They tell you we're Omanis in the interview. So I think the interview, because the scholarship in the 80s depended on interview heavily. And when people said we are Omanis, that was taken as the loss of their African identity, which was not true. What they tell you really there is that I can show it to you better than I can explain it to you. And for example, I met one of the black Omanis, and I asked him, what's your relationship to Africa? And he got very mad, and he pointed to his skin and said, do you see my skin like yours? So if we can't see that the people as if they're telling us, then we don't deserve to know.
Should I address that question?
Of course.
Yeah, Nicole, the musicians, as you can see, when I was in Salalah for the Mahrajan al-Kharif, most of the musicians that were there were playing Afro-Omani musics, which involve really complex percussion. There's usually 4 or 5 different drummers, sometimes also playing conch shell, keyboards, oud, maybe 8 or 10 singers. So it's really very exciting music. And this didn't happen the first day, but by the end of the time when I was sitting having tea with the musicians, they said, our music is more complex than any other music. This is the most interesting. Our music is more complex than all that stuff they have in Turkey and Egypt and whatever. I mean, fiercely proud of this. But there is an idea, and I think when you look at other musics, particularly in the Emirates or the north of Oman, where there really are not musical instruments, or where when drummers were added, they were drummers of a servant class, right? So you have this wonderful traditions of poetry. So when you look for what are we going to nationalize as music, there's a rich repository in those Afro-Omani traditions. And again, people say, oh, you want good music? Go to Sur, go to Salalah. And then finally, there is a kind of a nervousness about other institutions in the Gulf grabbing those traditions as, for example, UNESCO intangible heritage pieces. And so there's a kind of a race to say, these things originated here in Oman, here in Salalah. So before somebody else sort of claims them as kind of a general Gulf thing, people talked about, people would come from Dubai and record them and then release these recordings as Gulf, just general Gulf music when they feel very strongly that this is Omani music. So.
Very interesting. Questions? Controversy? Argument? Well, on behalf of the panel, let's thank the panel and our hosts and our sponsors. For those of you who wouldn't speak out and want to come up and talk, we'll be here for a few more minutes.